Right, so the events of Wednesday's farce of an SNP Opposition Day are still prominent, still rumbling away in the news, which, thanks to the Speaker Lindsay Hoyle, of course, ended up becoming a Labour Opposition Day debate. But if Keir Starmer thought he was walking away with a win, he might be very much mistaken. Be it arrogance or stupidity, he's made a couple of admissions following the collapse of the SNP's Opposition Day debate, one of which was completely dishonest, the other has been making people wonder who exactly is in charge of the Labour Party now, and he's been reported for it too. So if you thought this was all over now and Labour had pulled off a coup, benefiting Israel by excusing them of accusations of collective punishment and thinking Labour, being the party calling for a ceasefire, was a win, there might be a heavy price to pay for their stunt, and it's about time it was Starmer himself who was made to pay it. Right, so I'm going to start with a couple of video clips here from the same interview, a Sky News interview, one of which they actually pulled from social media, but not before being caught and saved by other people. Have a listen to this.
Having spoken to the President of Israel, i.e. having spoken to the people who are actually involved in trying to wait for this awful conflict, I can categorically tell you that I did not threaten the Speaker in any way whatsoever. I simply urged him to ensure that we had the broadest possible debate.
And your MPs?
Broadest possible debate, so that actually the most important thing, which is what do we do about the awful situation in Gaza, could be properly discussed by MPs with a number of options in front of them. That's the right thing to do. The Speaker did the right thing in making sure the debate was broad. But the tragedy is the SNP walked off the pitch because they wanted to divide the Labour Party and they couldn't, and the government walked off the pitch because it thought it was going to lose a vote. So we had one party that was simply seeking to divide on an important issue. The government has lost control of its own MPs and couldn't control the vote.
Right, so this interview was very much all about what happened on Wednesday during that SNP Opposition Day debate. That collapsed into a complete joke, as it did, with Speaker Lindsay Hoyle changing the rules as it seemed to suit Labour, and accusation came quickly afterwards that he'd been lent on, he'd been blackmailed, he'd been threatened by Labour, by Starmer, or the Labour Whip's office, or Sue Gray even, somebody from the Labour Party, that he would lose Labour's support to return to the position of Speaker following the general election if Hoyle didn't call Labour's amendment to the SNP motion. Now, if you saw both of my videos yesterday, you'll know that this meant the Labour motion, if called, would have been heard before the Opposition Day Party's motion, which is not the done thing, isn't convention, because it means potentially that party, in this case the SNP, might not be able to bring their motion at all, either being timed out because of an extra amendment having to be dealt with within the allotted time, or because the amendment passes, changing their motion before they even get a chance to bring it. This is the crux of the hell up. The Speaker set aside a standing order for Labour's benefit, it appears, because Starmer, faced with backing the SNP motion, which included reference to Israel's collective punishment in Gaza, which he couldn't tolerate, or backing the Tory amendment, which he abstained on essentially back in November, put him in a bind. If he abstained on both, he wasn't backing a ceasefire at all, and all the public fallout that would create with him sitting on the fence again, getting splinters in his backside, as would backing the Tories also cause fallout. Backing the SNP motion, which was sensible and sound, he just refused to do. He would not tolerate that criticism of Israel. Which now brings us to those clips you just watched. The first clip that came up, very short, is the one that Sky News deleted off social media because it apparently caused absolute uproar. Because Starmer said he'd spoken to the President of Israel, claiming he was speaking to the people looking for a way forward in this conflict. So you spoke to the President of Israel, Isaac Herzog, then. That would be this guy, signing missiles to drop on Gaza. The guy who came up in South Africa's submissions to the International Court of Justice as one, for instance, having been quoted as saying of the Gazan people, "We are operating militarily according to rules of international law. Unequivocally, it is an entire nation out there that is responsible. It is not true, this rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved. It is absolutely not true. They could have risen up. They could have fought against that evil regime which took over Gaza in a coup d'etat. But we are at war, we are at war, we are at war. We are defending our homes, we are protecting our homes. That's the truth. And when a nation protects its home, it fights. And we will fight until we break their backbone. All Palestinians are guilty, the entire nation are guilty. Therefore, we're operating according to international law. That's his rationale. The fact 50% of the population of Gaza are under 18 means this war, this genocide, is against kids. Gaza has been described as a cemetery for children. South Africa using his words against him. He's called that a blood libel, them doing that. But they aren't the only ones holding him to his disgusting verbiage. Since Herzog's trip to the World Economic Forum in Davos in Switzerland led to criminal complaints specifically against him made there too. However, the nature of these have not been specified, nor specifically who has filed them. Hopefully we'll find out in due course. But that's the President of Israel, folks, and that's who Starmer apparently spoke to ahead of this vote on Wednesday. Why bring that up in relation to being questioned about what happened on Wednesday? Well, despite the shortness of the clip, Starmer inferred this was because he's one of the people dealing with the situation in Gaza as a justification. But it isn't a justification when Herzog is the Israeli president and is one of the people responsible, therefore, for the genocide itself, not dealing with it, running it. Therefore, why speak to him on this matter? You weren't asking for a ceasefire because the Labour amendment didn't really ask for one. Because without demanding an immediate ceasefire, you simply backed one at some indeterminate point in future. What his amendment also did was strip out the bits of the SNP motion that blamed Israel for committing atrocity, collective punishment, a war crime. And Starmer admits to having done that after having met Herzog at the security meeting he attended with David Lammy in Munich shortly before returning to speak to Scottish Labour, promising a ceasefire and then doing what he did afterwards to the SNP motion in the Commons. It is impossible to look at this situation and think, well, did Starmer just take orders and instruction from Herzog in which case? The human rights lawyer, taking his lead, having spoken to someone whose words were used as part of the evidence accusing his country of genocide. Is it any wonder at this point people are beginning to think, well, perhaps it isn't just Palestine under Israeli occupation, but the Labour Party are as well? Sure, go ahead and vote Labour. Will we literally have our country run by Herzog and Netanyahu afterwards? Or will it be more like criticism of Israel becomes a criminal offence? Seriously, it makes you wonder, and especially on that last point, you wouldn't put it past them. Certainly we now know it was Starmer who went and spoke to Lindsay Hoyle, because the longer clip there showed, he admitted it. He denied threatening him, encouraged instead the broadest possible debate, he said, which does marry up to Hoyle's claims at the time he announced that Labour's amendment would be heard, that it was so that MPs could vote on his ceasefire motion that suited them, the broadest possible terms, broadening the debate to the point, sadly, that Israel ended up getting exonerated of any fault. You convinced the Speaker, let's put it that way, convinced, we'll stick with that word convinced, to set aside a House of Commons standing order to get your amendment heard on an opposition day, which wasn't Labour's, knowing that meant it would be heard first, and the Speaker, knowing this was a bad idea, because the Clerk of the Commons had told him, the Clerk of the Commons published a letter afterwards in the aftermath of Wednesday's opposition day debate pointing that out. So Starmer must have been very, very convincing if he wasn't threatening Hoyle to get Hoyle to break with parliamentary procedure. Starmer said it was all about Gaza, doing the right thing. But we all know what the right thing is, and it had nothing to do with Gaza. The boycott the right thing is to boycott Israel, end the arms trade with them, and demand an immediate ceasefire. That isn't what Labour put forward, though. In fact, it was pretty much the opposite of that. If Labour had been backing an immediate ceasefire, there would have been no need for an SNP Opposition Day on it at all, because there would have been no need for one. What Starmer did was seek to muddy the waters and cause chaos. And that's exactly what he did. And that had nothing to do with Gaza. It had everything to do with facing a massive rebellion in his own party. He got his way, his amendment passed, the SNP motion never got voted on, the Tories withdrew their correctly submitted amendment, it supersedes Labour on opposition days as they are in government. Israel got saved, as did Starmer's blushes. He even then had the brass neck to say it was the SNP intentionally trying to split the Labour Party, because sure, using one of their 3 opposition day debates to split Labour is clearly what they're all about. You egotistical twonk. Labour have 17 opposition day opportunities in comparison. They haven't bothered with a ceasefire on one of them. And thinking of Gaza before now. So don't pretend that's the most important thing. A proper debate and a proper resolution is what he wants, he said in that last clip. Yet that is exactly what his actions sought to avoid. But if he thinks he's won, well, he might be about to get a rude shock. Having confessed to having spoken to Hoyle, people want to know exactly what was said now. Starmer said he didn't threaten him. If you still believe anything Keir Starmer says and take his word as gospel for anything, then you're a bit of a fool, because he lies like a rug. But one person definitely not accepting his word is Alba Party MP Neil Hanvey. If you're wondering who elected the Alba Party in Parliament and don't recall them being mentioned at the last general election, it's because they didn't exist. This is the vehicle of former SNP leader Alex Salmond, and 2 SNP MPs defected to Alba the month after it formed in 2021. Hanvey is one of them. Anyway, an allegation of coercion or blackmail against the Speaker of the House of Commons, well, you might be wondering by now if this was ever going to be something worthy of an actual investigation. Surely it should be. And quite right too. And as such, Hanvey has reported Starmer to the Privileges Committee, saying that it is essential to establish if Starmer coerced the Speaker into putting forward Labour's amendment, because if so, that would make Starmer guilty of contempt of the House of Commons. If found guilty of that, he could face suspension from the House or even expulsion, which, given he's the leader of the opposition, really ought to make him, to my mind, and excusing my bias of course, someone to whom an example ought to be made if found guilty. Of course, a suspension of more than 2 weeks could trigger a recall petition, dumping Starmer out of Parliament too. So this really could have enormous consequences for Starmer now. At any rate, Hanvey's letter to the chair of the Privileges Committee, Harriet Harman, reads thusly. Dear Ms Harman and committee members, in the course of the last 24 hours it has been reported in the media and to the Chamber that the Leader of the Opposition, and or those acting on his behalf, applied unwarranted and unacceptable pressure on the Speaker of the House for political purposes. It has been alleged that this course of conduct was pursued to ensure that the Labour amendment to the SNP motion for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza was given priority as the Leader of the Opposition sought to prevent his members voting against the Labour Party whip. Furthermore, it has been alleged that the Speaker was subjected to coercive threats relating to the support he could expect to receive from the Labour Party in any upcoming general election to force his hand to break with convention and act against the advice of the Clerk of the House. In order to reassure the House, I am asking the Committee of Privileges to initiate an urgent and rapid investigation into the allegations set out above, including any and all related matters. I would also request that any such investigation specifically examine the actions of Leader of the Opposition and consider whether the Right Honourable Member's conduct amounted to a contempt of the House. Now, Harman, I can imagine, will want to try and get Starmer off this hook, but whether she feels able to is another matter. The Privileges Committee consists currently of 2 Labour MPs, 4 Tories and 1 SNP. So it'll be an interesting one if Hanvey's complaint even gets accepted. Frankly, if it doesn't, things are just going to look so much worse for Parliament, as it will look even more corrupt. And this is especially true since Hoyle can't seem to get his story straight on these matters either, which I'm going to go into on my next vid. But Starmer hasn't just shown what appears to be contempt for the House of Commons, but also contempt for Gaza. All those people still suffering, still dying, still starving, and even now, it looks like he's putting Israel first. He's just the most appallingly awful politician I can think of. Even with the Tories in power, he's right up there. And you can find out more about that on this video recommendation here. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.